A while back, I took a look at two small Chromebooks. In that video, I mentioned the upcoming Framework 12, and I said it may make those other machines irrelevant depending on pricing. Well, the price of those other machines has gone up, but they are still cheaper than the Framework 12. So what can you expect from the cheapest Framework 12 you can put together, and is it a good value? Let's check it out. Whether you go DIY or pre-built, the Framework 12 isn't a super budget laptop, but it's at least toward the lower end for 2-in-1 machines. You can save a bit of money with the DIY version, especially if you run Linux, but you won't save very much if you have to buy a copy of Windows. Windows is still more mainstream than Linux, so I did install Windows on this machine for testing. But note that this machine is compatible with many versions of Linux, and Framework even offers official support for several distros. I got a DIY machine with the slower i3-1315U. I also chose the cheapest RAM and SSD I could find without going with brands or sellers I was unsure about. I got a 256GB Transcend SSD for $40 and an 8GB stick of Crucial RAM for around $25. If you get the DIY version, I'd recommend going with at least 16GB of RAM and a slightly larger, faster SSD, given the relatively small price difference. But I wanted to see how it would perform when outfitted as cheaply as possible, and I thought it would be nice to match the 8GB of RAM that the cheapest pre-built unit has. In general, the price to performance isn't a match for some of the competition out there. A lot of the 2-in-1 competitors are similar or even higher priced, but I found some options on sale that matched or beat the performance of the Framework 12 at a lower price. The Framework 12 also lacks some modern conveniences you may expect from a device in this price range, like USB 4 or Thunderbolt ports, an IR webcam for Windows Hello, a fingerprint reader, or even a backlit keyboard. However, that's not to say you're getting nothing for your money. Like all Framework computers, this one is easy to repair and upgrade. In fact, it's their easiest yet. And while lacking a sleek aluminum body seems like a step down, I think the color options and durability it offers could be real positives for some people. Like the Chromebooks I checked out, this laptop has a slightly more rugged, kind of chuckable feel to it compared to some other laptops. Sort of like old flip phones versus a smartphone. The body is plastic, and it has slightly rubberized TPU bumpers around the edges. When closed, it feels rock solid. Even the back of the display housing requires a lot of force to make it deflect. It definitely feels more solid than my Framework 13, or even the 11-inch HP Chromebook I have, which is also sort of, ruggedized. Not that I would literally throw this around very much, but it definitely feels less delicate than some other laptops, including the Framework 13 and 16. There are physical switches to turn off the webcam and microphone, and it's not just a privacy shutter that blocks the lens. They are hardware switches that actually turn the microphone and camera off. The touchscreen has a good resolution, and it has pen support. Framework is making a pen with a replaceable battery. Unfortunately, it isn't available yet, but you can use any pen that supports MPP 2.0 or USI 2.0. If you're wondering, there's no built-in way to store a pen. I currently have a ViaScreen's paper-like screen protector on the laptop. It slightly reduces sharpness and contrast, but it also cuts down a lot on reflections and glare. And while I don't really prefer the extra drawing friction, some might, and it makes it a lot more comfortable and feel a bit less awkward to rest my hand on the display versus resting it directly on glass. Speaking of which, when using it like a tablet and drawing it with your hand resting on the display, my hand will sometimes activate stuff as I'm drawing, but overall, palm rejection, or hand rejection in this case, is actually pretty good. Even with my hand and wrist draped across the screen feels solid, and it doesn't really activate stuff that often. I did some drawing with a Microsoft Slim Pen 2 that I borrowed, and it worked just fine without any pairing or anything, and even flipping it around to erase just worked. Clip Studio Paint runs without issues. Maybe if I had a ton of layers or something like that, it would slow down, but for a quick sketch, it runs great. I'm not an artist by any means, and certainly not a professional. For notes, sketching up some diagrams, or even some doodling, it's more than good enough for me. But there is some pen wobble when drawing slow diagonal lines, and I don't have enough skill or experience to say what other issues it may or may not have for a pro artist. So just keep that in mind if you are wanting this for professional art. It's probably not up to the standards of higher-end or dedicated drawing tablets, but it seemed fine, and it's fun for casual drawing. Another word of caution if you're wanting to use this machine for serious art or anything that requires high color accuracy. I tested the screen before I put the screen protector on, and I got a result of 68% sRGB and 52% NTSC coverage. Not the worst results ever, and it's slightly above the stated specs, but it is something to consider if you need to do color-accurate work. Subjectively, the display seems to render reds a bit orange to my eyes. Objectively, here are the results of testing it. The colors don't extend very deep into the reds, so it makes sense that some reds look a bit orange. But back to subjective, it's totally fine for general use and even looks pretty good for normal content consumption. It has good contrast, decent black levels, and it gets reasonably bright. I measured max brightness at 460 nits, which also slightly beats the stated specs. The screen is glossy glass, but as I mentioned, the ViaScreen's screen protector I installed has a very matte finish. If you want to do color-accurate work, there are multiple ways to connect external displays. Not only can you get HDMI and DisplayPort expansion cards, I have a cheap external monitor that connects directly with a USB-C cable. I can plug that monitor into any of the ports on this machine, and it will get power and display signal over a single USB-C cable. I also connected the laptop to a USB-C dock, in this case an Anker 556. It worked without issue, including pass-through charging and providing display output, so no problem there. When flipping the display into tablet mode, the hinges put a bit of pressure on the bottom of the display, causing a bit of light bleed. Still, I've seen worse on what is intended to be a budget device. Like Framework's other computers, the 12 has their expansion card system, which allows you to customize and swap out your ports. As mentioned before, none of the ports are Thunderbolt or even USB 4. They are USB 3.2 Gen 1 on the left side and Gen 2 on the right. All 4 ports are capable of power delivery, and all support DisplayPort 1.4 HBR3, so you can connect an external display to any port. The touchpad is a reasonable size for a smallish laptop. The physical click is okay, but it is a diving board style, so it sort of hinges at the top. For that style, the physical click feels fine. The surface of the touchpad feels very smooth, cursor movement is smooth and responsive, and taps and gestures work great. Honestly, it's about as good as a non-MacBook trackpad gets, in my opinion. The keyboard is also pretty good for a small, budget laptop. The deck is a bit more spongy than on some other machines, but I'm a fairly light typer, so that doesn't bother me too much. The key travel and weight are pretty good, and the size and spacing is fairly close to a full-size keyboard. It has an arrow key setup that I don't think is anybody's favorite, but they ran the keys close to the edges, so despite the laptop being a 1/4 of an inch narrower overall than my 11-inch Chromebook, the keyboard on the Framework 12 is about a 1/2 inch wider, so I don't get the slightly cramped typing feel that I get on the Chromebook. The keycaps are lightly textured, which in my experience usually makes keys feel a bit cheap and plasticky. Maybe it's the material or the specific texture, but these feel okay. A bit plasticky feeling, but not as bad as the textured keys on my HP Chromebook or on my Logitech K950 keyboard. Overall, not a super high-end typing experience, but it's not bad at all. In terms of performance, there's no big surprise here. The Framework 12 uses low-power 13th Gen Intel processors and a single channel of DDR5 RAM. It's not going to be a powerhouse for intensive programs or gaming. But for general use, you don't really need a high-end processor these days. If you had a reasonably high-end, high-wattage desktop machine like 8 years ago, there's a good chance the i3 in this machine is as capable, if not more so for some tasks. That's not surprising since that's kind of a long time in terms of computer tech, but it's just some perspective. That high-end desktop processor from 8 years ago would still be more than fast enough for most general tasks today, and so is the i3 in this machine. The integrated GPU and shared single-channel RAM will definitely limit graphics performance though. But that's not to say you can't run some simpler or older games. I didn't run any benchmarks or anything, but I will show the performance in a few games. I'm not going to go super in-depth testing a ton of games, but I just wanted to give you at least a basic idea of the kind of gaming performance you can get from this machine. Even with the i3 and 8 GB of RAM, you can play some games. Just nothing too graphically intensive. During light sort of general use, the bottom of the laptop gets fairly warm. I measured a peak of around 40 to 42 C, which is around 107 Fahrenheit. That wasn't when I was stressing the machine or, doing anything super intensive. That was just browsing the internet, downloading programs, watching YouTube videos, that kind of thing. It's not going to burn you, but it is pretty warm. If it sits on your lap for a while, you can feel the warmth building up a bit. But it doesn't give the impression that it's quite as hot as it is because it's plastic, so it doesn't transfer the heat to you as quickly as an aluminum chassis would. So overall, it's not too bad, and for me, I can deal with that warmth, especially since the intake vent for the cooling fan isn't on the bottom like it is on a lot of machines. Both the intake and exhaust vents for the cooling fan are in the back. So even if it does start to warm up, I'm not worried that it's because I'm blocking the vent. I really like that setup because I don't have to worry about blocking it by simply setting the computer on my lap or on the arm of a couch, on a pillow, or by flipping it into tablet mode. Speaking of that fan, during light use the fan does run, but it's barely audible. When the fan ramps up, the noise is sort of middle of the road for a laptop. It's not super quiet, but it's not super loud or high-pitched either. I also found that if I put the power setting in Windows to best power efficiency, the fan doesn't ramp up quite as often. And in light use, I don't notice a performance penalty, so that's nice. So far, the main way I've found this machine to feel slightly slower than a high-end laptop is in launching programs, and I wonder if part of that is because of the cheap SSD I went with. A Sabrent Rocket, for instance, is spec'd at like 2 to 5 times faster than the cheap, older generation Transcend I installed. Still though, it does work fine. Otherwise, performance feels fine in my day-to-day use. Watching videos, internet browsing, editing a few photos, using Handbrake to transcode a few videos, etc. It all worked fine for me. Granted, more RAM would definitely help or even be required for some programs, and if you tried to batch edit a bunch of photos, edit 4K video, or run a more intensive program, I'm sure you could start to make it chug a bit. But for light use, it's not bad even with 8 GB of RAM. Though again, with a 16 GB stick only costing about $15 more than 8 GB, I'd still recommend going with 16. Battery life is just okay. I did test with a YouTube video playing continuously, and I was also browsing the internet, downloading and installing programs, and doing some word processing and stuff. The battery dropped from 80% to around 20% in 4 hours. So I would guess it would get around 6 to 8 hours max of mixed, mostly light use like that, with a fully charged battery. I had the performance mode in Windows set to balanced, and I had the display brightness set probably around 25% or so. I see a lot of machines advertised with much longer battery life than this, but I question whether or not they'd actually last longer in the real world when a lot of them have similar processors and similar or even smaller capacitor batteries. For reference, this machine has a 50 watt-hour battery. Some framework devices seem to have quirks with certain chargers. I'll admit I haven't had the issues some folks have had, but I still wanted to test as many chargers as I could get my hands on with the Framework 12. In the end, I not only tested pass-through charging with the Anchor dock, I also connected directly to a Ugreen 100-watt charger, the Framework 65-watt charger, a Belkin 67-watt charger, a 45-watt Steam Deck charger, an Exelon 45-watt, an Insignia 35-watt, a Ugreen 30-watt, a Belkin 30-watt, a tiny Anchor 20-watt, and a generic 20-watt. They all worked fine. The only thing I plugged in that didn't seem to work was a 7.5 watt, 5 volt only USB-A charger that I connected with a USB-A to C cable. Basically, a very simple 5 volt USB charger that doesn't support USB power delivery. I can't promise that it wasn't charging the battery, but whether the laptop was on or off, the charge light didn't come on with that charger plugged in. And it didn't say it was charging. Basically, I think the charger does have to support power delivery. But every PD charger I tried worked, so it doesn't seem to be too picky. Ultimately, the Framework 12 is not the cheapest machine, nor does it have the very best cost-to-performance ratio you can find. And it lacks some features people have come to expect on modern laptops like Thunderbolt ports, fingerprint sensors, and backlit keyboards. But it is solid and durable. It's versatile, it's totally repairable, it's upgradable, it has swappable ports, it has excellent Linux support. When running Windows, it's essentially as bloat-free as Windows can be these days, and it's available in fun colors. It won't be the best machine for everyone, but it has a lot going for it. So yeah, I think it's a good value. I think it's a good little machine that has some flaws, but it gets a lot of things right and it's super versatile. I like it. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.